You are considered by some to be a controversial researcher, based mostly on the first study that you did. Describe that if you can.
Certainly the first study was a case series, a report of the clinical findings and the histories of 12 children who had regressed into an autistic spectrum disorder. 8 of the parents of the children saying that this was following an MMR vaccine. And our duty was not only to investigate those children, to see if we could get to the root of their symptoms, in particular their bowel symptoms, their diarrhea, their pain, and their maldigestion, but also to report their history. My child regressed after an MMR vaccine. We don't place any interpretation on that, and we said specifically this does not prove an association between the vaccine and the disorder, but we have an obligation as doctors and scientists to faithfully report what the parent has told to us.
What did the study find? What was the conclusion in essence?
The conclusion was that there is a bowel disease in children with autism, which is new, which has not been investigated before, that this may well be related to the developmental regression since they had occurred at around the same time, and that the association, the parental association with MMR exposure needed to be thoroughly investigated.
What year was this?
This was 1998.
Now, while you certainly in the study, which I have read, did not recommend people stop vaccinating their children, it didn't make any sort of recommendations like that. In fact, you've told me before your children have been vaccinated, your own children.
That's right, my first 2 children received the MMR.
However, there was sort of a scare, and people in England, some people quit vaccinating their kids based on hearing of this possible association.
Well, what actually happened is that I recommended, based upon not just upon that study, but upon a review of all of the literature of vaccine safety studies looking at measles virus, going to a report of 250 pages which I wrote, that I could no longer support the MMR vaccine. I would continue to vigorously support the use of single vaccines, spaced out, but the safety studies of MMR vaccine were not there. They were not adequate.
In other words, give measles separately from mumps, separately from rubella, not at once?
That's right. And so having made that recommendation when the single vaccines were still available in the UK, the government then decided, for some reason, in the August of that year, the paper having been published in February, to withdraw the importation license for the single vaccines. In other words, to make it virtually impossible for parents to choose the option of a single vaccine. So if parents had genuine concerns about the safety of MMR, it was either our way, MMR, or no way. And so the attrition, the fall-off in the uptake of the vaccine can be laid at the door of the British government for withdrawing the option.
But then it was reported that most of the co-authors on your study recanted the whole study.
Yes, that's been widely reported as that. In fact, they didn't. What they did was to retract an interpretation. They didn't retract the scientific findings at all, which is what has been reported. What they retracted was the interpretation that measles virus or the measles MMR vaccine caused autism. Now,
and that was a misinterpretation
yes.
to begin with because the study didn't say that.
That's absolutely correct. The interpretation was that it may be linked and this needs investigation. Now that's a possibility, and you cannot retract a possibility. A possibility exists, and it still exists, and it needs to be investigated. So it was an unfortunate retraction. What was even more unfortunate was the way at which it has been used in a sort of public relations exercise to seek to discredit the study, and it was false.
But you have been discredited by some, or at least there's been an attempt to discredit you, and you also have a case pending or a case about you in the British courts.
Sharyl, here's the deal. If you get involved in this kind of thing, then the first way of dealing with people who dissent from things like safety of drugs or vaccines is to isolate them and to discredit them and to make them an example to other doctors, not even to get involved in this in the first place. Let me quote you from the Vioxx trial in Australia that has just come out. It was fascinating. There was an exchange of internal emails at Merck about how they dealt with doctors who dissented from the use of Vioxx, said it wasn't safe. And it talked about how they would isolate them and discredit them. And the final one was the most telling of all. It said, we may have to seek them out and destroy them where they live.
And Vioxx is a drug that was pulled from the market for safety reasons,
Absolutely,
ultimately.
having been responsible for the death of many people. We may have to seek them out and destroy them where they live. And so Matt Lauer asked me the other day whether this was I was just indulging in conspiracy theory. And I read this out to him, and I said, Matt, this is not an issue of conspiracy theory. This is corporate policy.
And lastly, I can't end the interview without saying there have been follow-up charges of conflict of interest involving the study that you did, and just many misinterpretation or fudging on the data. How do you answer those charges?
Well, they are entirely false, and they've been shown to be false. There was no conflict of interest with the Lancet. The claim was that the Lancet study had been funded by the Legal Aid Board, that money had come effectively from lawyers to fund that study. Not one single penny of Legal Aid Board funding was spent on that study. And that was the reason it was not disclosed in that paper. The Lancet knew that, and my co-authors knew that as well. So that there was no question of a conflict of interest. The Lancet conflict rules were followed to the letter in that paper. The issue of fudging the data is bizarre. The journalist who made those allegations, indeed the same freelancer who's made all of these allegations, made that allegation of fudging the data, having sat through the hearing at the General Medical Council and heard the data, which was quite to the contrary. There have been no allegations or charges whatsoever at the General Medical Council of having fudged data. And this is the longest running hearing of its kind in history.
Well, we will post information that let people make up their own mind, where they'll be able to read about both sides of this. And thank you for telling us your side.